Hi, welcome today. I want to talk to you today about assessing impact. And I want to be looking at whether you're running an ILC, Innovative Learning Community, or any sort of project that you're running at a school. How do we start to think about the impact that we're having on the learning of our students, and how do we start to assess that impact? So obviously we're going to be looking at data today, but I'm 100% aware that when we use that word data, for many of us as teachers, that can be a bit of a trigger. And there's a lot of things going on in the world at the moment saying to teachers, use data, use data. And in fact, a lot of those things can be actually quite disruptive and cause a lot of panic and cause a lot of trials and tribulations. However, I do think that we know that using data is helpful. And I think as teachers, we're always using data, whether that's just in a classroom when we're immediately assessing our students and then making a decision as to whether they've actually learned what we want them to learn. That's also using data as well. So let's have a look at this question of data when it comes to assessing impact. And let's have a think about how perhaps can we do that better without feeling burnt out. So it's all about useful data rather than just data for data's sake. And a key point to understand here is this relationship between correlation and causation. And here are a couple of funny graphs that can get you thinking about this idea. But here's a graph that shows that Nicolas Cage, when he was in films, for some reason, exactly following that, correlating with when he was in films, were also the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool in the United States of America. So when he's in more films, more people drowned by falling into a pool. Obviously not connected, but certainly correlates. And if you have a look at the next graph I'm going to show you, which is the divorce rate in Maine in the United States and the per capita consumption of margarine, they correlate almost perfectly. So can we draw a conclusion from that and say, well, the less margarine you eat, therefore, the less likely you are to get a divorce? Obviously not. So what Pasi Salzberg said is that don't let big data drive your innovation, because big data shows just these correlations, whereas small data shows causations. Pasi Salzberg, as you know, works at University of New South Wales, quite a famous Finnish educator, also did a lot of work in his home country of Finland. And it's that idea of small data, data that we as teachers actually can access, that we as teachers can control, which can be incredibly powerful rather than looking at big data. The definition of evidence-based practice, which I find really helpful, comes originally from the medical profession. And what they say is, for an evidence-based practice approach, first of all, ask answerable questions, access the best information, analyze the information for validity and relevance, and then apply the information to teaching and learning. But there's a lot to unpick in this definition. It's a good one, but it's not as simple as it looks. And if we first of all start by focusing on accessing the best information, well, I think that's something that we need to start considering a lot as teachers as well. A lot of information gets thrown at us, and we're pretty trusting souls, and we'll access this information and say, yes, we'll use it, we'll use that as well. And perhaps we need to start getting a little bit more questioning when it comes to that. What are valid inputs and outputs for data? That's what we've got to ask our question. What are the valid and the relevant inputs that we should be using to formulate our analysis? I went and saw Dylan Wiliam a couple of weeks ago here in Melbourne, in Australia. He was over and he talked a lot about this. You know, he's a bit of a data guru, certainly a formative assessment guru. And I went to his speech organized by Hawker Brownlow on educational leadership. And he was actually quite critical, particularly of Professor Hattie and this idea of metadata analysis. And he was critical from 2 points of view. The first one he said is that really 8%, only 8% is the effect that a school can have on the achievement of students. It's actually quite a small amount. A lot of the other data inputs, a lot of the other things that are affecting student progress, as we all know, are things that from a school perspective are a bit out of our control. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. But when we're looking at this idea of metadata, he also had quite a few challenges to that in terms of data inputs. So if we use homework as an example, the metadata, Hattie's metadata, I think shows about a 0.4 improvement in terms of using research that shows in terms of using homework. So a 4-month extension of learning, if you like, according to Hattie, you use homework, you get about 4 months better learning. So it's not great, but it's also not terrible. You know, it's at least above 0. And Dylan Wiliam talked a lot about these sorts of figures like 4 months. And his first issue to do with the input was, for example, with homework. What do those homework studies actually look like? Is it homework that's being set by teachers in a really traditional sense, where essentially they are reinforcing the learning that they've already done in the classroom? Is it flipped learning? Homework where, in fact, the students are learning something new by maybe watching a Khan Academy or a TED Talk and then coming into learning and enacting that learning? Is it flipped? Is it homework that is quite mechanical? Is it homework that is really learner agency driven, where they're actually looking and exploring things? Is it problem-based learning or project-based learning? The problem with the metadata is that we don't know, that all of these types of homeworks are all thrown into a pot, stirred up, and out pops a 0.4 improvement, a 4-month improvement if you use homework. So with big data, Dylan Wiliam's point about Hattie is it's not particularly helpful, because we're just seeing a really big overarching picture about something that really you could go into a much more granular level. So that was one of his challenges to Hattie's metadata. And when we're looking at that number 2 point, accessing the best information, is that metadata really the best possible information that we can access? Once we've accessed it, we have to start thinking about, well, analyzing the information for validity and relevance. And that's the same sort of question. Are we really, when we use a term like metacognition that can have an 8-month increase in learning, wow, that looks fantastic, according to Professor Hattie. But really, is it 8 months? What does metacognition mean as part of Hattie's hits? Is that, yes, getting kids to think about their learning? How are we getting them to think about their own learning and their own thinking? What are we doing there? So this idea of validity and relevance is really important. So essentially, Dylan Wiliam's main point to us was that, in fact, we know, you know, as teachers, your school, your students, and your context. So you know if this type of homework might work really effectively. You know if this metacognitive thinking schools or cultures of thinking, if that will work with your cohort, with your students at your school. And therefore, you should feel empowered to actually implement some of those ideas. Maybe you don't know, and maybe this is what we're doing, we're testing. But I suppose the whole point about Dylan Wiliam's presentation last week was that as school leaders, we can all actually find the data that we need to find. We can all analyze that data, and we can all actually see if that's working with the students in our school in front of us. So you're in the best position to work out what works best. If we're using this as a really nice, easy diagram in terms of how we're going to start assessing whether our own innovative learning communities or projects are actually working, this is a good one just to start with and to think about, well, what do each of these stages mean to us? And I think one of the miscomprehensions, I would say, when we're doing some of this data analysis is what data input really means. Some people say to me, well, data input is a pre-test, and then I teach the material, and then I do a post-test afterwards, and I can see, oh, this is how much the student has improved. And I think that's fine. And that is useful for everybody as a teacher to see, has a student actually taken in the material that we've been trying to teach that student? But I think we need to think a little bit more holistically about what that data input could be, because it's not just a bit of background knowledge. It could well be student background, socioeconomic, cultural. It could be the funding and the facilities. Depending on your school, where you're at, what sort of community you're in, that has a huge impact. As I said, school impact earlier in my presentation has only about 8%. Things like student background, funding and facilities has a massive impact when it comes to student achievement. Yes, preceding knowledge is there, but other teaching of those particular students, maybe other observations from other teachers, maybe the performance of other cohorts in a similar situation could also be part of your data input. Then, of course, you have this student, teacher, or curriculum or pedagogy interaction. This is the thing that you're doing. The thing that is essentially that you want to test, the thing that you want to interrogate to see if this works better than what used to be done. And that's the teaching and learning and process. But more importantly, any change that you have made to this teaching and learning and process. So if you do a pre-test, you teach them the material, and then you do a post-test, well, yes, you can see how much those students learned. But is this really data analysis in terms of actually assessing a strategy? The only way of really looking at a strategy and really seeing if this particular strategy has worked is by assessing data performance across cohorts and across years. So for example, perhaps this year, you teach a particular skill in maths using a more traditional chalk and talk approach. You model it, you show what they need to do, then they do it, then they do a test. So you've done a pre-test, not much knowledge, you teach the material, and then you do a summative test at the end, and you can see how much they've learned. Great, you know if they've learned the material or not. The next year, you go away, and instead of teaching it chalk and talk and modeling it, you use a dialogic learning approach. You get students, you show them, you get them to have discussions about it, you get them to model different ways, perhaps they teach each other, perhaps you create a whole dialogic learning approach to this particular unit of maths. Then they do their summative task. Now, again, you will see from the pre-test to the summative how much they've actually learned. But what's the more important data is to actually look at the summative test this year when you've done the dialogic learning approach and the summative test last year when you did a more traditional modeling approach, and you see which summative test did better. And then suddenly, instead of actually assessing just the learning of the students, you're actually assessing, using your data output, the strategy you used to teach those students. And I think that's one of the big issues, one of the big problems with how a lot of teachers do data analysis. Essentially, they do it as a part of an assessment for learning program, which is, have my students learned the material I want them to learn? Rather than a more strategic approach, which is, has the way that I've actually communicated, the way I've taught, has that been more successful this year because of a different approach compared to last year or the year before when I had a similar cohort? Now, don't forget, all of those things in data inputs at the top are also incredibly relevant. So maybe the background of your students, when you'd used a dialogic learning approach, maybe they came from a more advantaged background. And when you used a more modeling approach, maybe they came from a more disadvantaged background. So you've got to throw all those data inputs as well into that big cauldron of a spell of your thinking, because it might not just be the strategy you used. It might also be all of these other things as well. So data analysis is difficult. And that was one of the things that came across in Dylan Williams' presentation. He was actually very self-deprecating, and he said, look, I don't know. I did all these tests about 20 or 30 years ago. I did all this research and I was so sure. And then the more I've looked into it, that's what Dylan Williams said, the more I realized I shouldn't have been so sure. There were so many other factors at play, which also could have changed my results. And so as teachers, we need to be always aware of those other factors as well. It's not always just us. So your analysis needs to include those key points about useful data. It needs, yes, to understand the effect of your teaching and learning, but even better, to understand the effectiveness of your teaching and learning strategy. And for that, you need to do year on year, or you need to work with colleagues. Maybe one colleague uses one approach and another colleague uses a different approach, and you see which one's more successful. But that's what really useful small data looks like. Are we assessing not just our teaching of a particular topic, concept, but are we actually assessing the strategies that we are using for that particular topic or concept. So if you've had a project, if you've done an innovative learning community and you're starting to get some of that data back right now, first of all, have a think about what are our data inputs? What are those things? Have you got a Track 1 learning analytics, some sort of computer program that you can look into and you can see what's the basis data here that's going on? What are some of the pre-tests that we're using? What's the socioeconomic status of the individual students? What are the backgrounds of those students, special learning needs, all of those things. Then what implementation, what interaction, what idea are you specifically trying to measure, trying to focus? Because then you need to create a test, if you like, which can, as best you can, make sure that you isolate that one individual idea. If this is the idea I'm going to be testing, is it dialogic learning? Is that the thing I want to test? Or is it something metacognition? Or is it a form of homework? I mentioned that earlier. How am I going to make sure that when I'm getting the data in, I'm genuinely testing that one idea? It's really difficult to do, but it's worth giving it a go. And again, we're not looking for massive effect sizes. We're only looking, as we say, school strategies tend to only have an effect of up to 8%. So we're looking for a small effect size. But if you can find one that you can clearly link to your implementation, to your idea, to your ILC, to your little project that you've decided to do, if you can find one that works, then you know this is really going to work. And this is something that we need to start thinking, the next step of scaling, of getting more teachers to do this, because we can genuinely prove that this little strategy has actually had an impact. I hope that's helpful. I hope that's been something that has got you thinking about how you might be using data, and got you considering not just using data to assess individual teaching and learning, but using data to assess individual teaching and learning strategies. Thanks very much.